Imagine a world where a simple scratch from a rose thorn could kill you, where a sore throat could lead to a fatal infection, where doctors could set a broken bone, but were powerless against the invisible enemies that would almost certainly invade the body afterward. This wasn't some distant, medieval past. This was the world our grandparents and great-grandparents were born into. Before the 1940s, hospitals were places people went not just to be cured, but often to die from infections that today we treat with a simple course of pills. The medical community was in a constant, losing battle against bacteria. They knew what caused the diseases, but they had no weapon to fight them inside the human body. They were desperate for a miracle, and the miracle did arrive. But it didn't come with a flash of lightning or a grand announcement. It began quietly in a cluttered, forgotten petri dish in a London laboratory, thanks to a scientist who was brilliant, but also famously untidy. His name was Alexander Fleming, and his discovery in 1928 would sit on a shelf for more than a decade before it would change the world. This is the story of penicillin, a delayed miracle. Alexander Fleming was a bacteriologist at St. Mary's Hospital in London. He was sharp, observant, but his lab was notoriously messy. He would often leave experiments stacked up on his bench while he went on vacation. In August of 1928, he did just that, leaving a pile of petri dishes containing Staphylococcus bacteria, a common source of infections, from boils to abscesses. When he returned in early September, he began cleaning up the clutter. He picked up one dish and was about to toss it into the cleaning solution when he noticed something odd. A blob of bluish-green mold was growing on one side of the dish. That wasn't unusual. But what was unusual was what was happening around the mold. In a clear circle around the mold, the bacteria had been completely wiped out. It was like a tiny, invisible shield was protecting the area. Fleming himself later said, "When I woke up just after dawn on September 28, 1928, I certainly didn't plan to revolutionize all medicine by discovering the world's first antibiotic. But I suppose that was exactly what I did." He took a sample of the mold and identified it as being from the Penicillium genus. He began referring to the substance it was releasing as mold juice, and later, more formally, penicillin. He was excited. He ran a few simple experiments and found that this juice was incredibly effective at killing a wide range of harmful bacteria. Even more importantly, when he tested it on living cells, it was harmless. This was the Holy Grail, something that could attack an invader without harming the host. He had found it, but finding it and making it useful were two very different things. Fleming was a bacteriologist, a brilliant observer of life. He was not a chemist. He tried to isolate the active ingredient in the mold juice, but it proved incredibly unstable. He couldn't get a pure, concentrated sample. He published his findings in a scientific journal in 1929, but it barely made a ripple. The paper was met with a collective shrug. It was an interesting laboratory curiosity, but no one saw its potential to be a game-changing drug. For the next 10 years, Fleming's discovery lay dormant. He would occasionally show his moldy plate to visitors, a relic of a brilliant but ultimately frustrating moment. Meanwhile, the world went on as it always had. People died from infected blisters, from pneumonia, from post-surgical infections. The miracle was right there in a scientific paper, but it was locked away. Think about that. A full decade. A decade of preventable deaths. A decade where the cure for so many of humanity's oldest enemies was a footnote in a medical journal. It's a powerful reminder that a discovery is only as good as its application. And for that, penicillin needed a new team of champions. Those champions emerged in 1939 at Oxford University, just as the world was teetering on the brink of another world war. A team led by two men, an Australian scientist named Howard Florey and a German Jewish refugee and brilliant chemist named Ernst Jahn, decided to systematically search for natural antibacterial agents. They stumbled upon Fleming's old paper. Jahn, the chemist, was intrigued by the challenge. He believed he could succeed where Fleming had failed. Together, he and Florey assembled a team to do one thing: isolate and purify penicillin. The timing was crucial. With war looming, The British government knew that infections would kill as many soldiers as bullets would. Their work was painstaking. They grew the Penicillium mold in anything they could find: bedpans, food tins, anything that could hold liquid. They used a complex, new technique called freeze-drying to finally stabilize the compound. After months of relentless work, they had a tiny amount of a brownish, impure powder. But it was hundreds of times more potent than Fleming's original juice. In May of 1940, they were ready to test it. They infected 8 mice with a lethal dose of streptococci bacteria. They treated 4 with their new penicillin powder and left 4 untreated. The next morning, the result was staggering. The 4 untreated mice were dead. The 4 that received penicillin were perfectly healthy. Howard Florey reportedly looked at the result and said quietly, "It looks quite promising." The next step was the human trial. In 1941, a 43-year-old policeman named Albert Alexander lay dying in a hospital. He had scratched the side of his mouth while pruning roses. The infection had spread, covering his face and head in horrific abscesses. He was losing an eye, and the bacteria was in his lungs. He was given the last rites. As a last resort, doctors gave him an injection of Florey and Chain's precious penicillin. The effect was miraculous. Within 24 hours, his fever dropped, and the infection began to recede. He started to recover, but their supply of the drug was tiny. So tiny, in fact, that they had to collect the penicillin from his urine, rush it back to the lab, repurify it, and inject it back into him. They stretched their supply for 5 days, and he improved dramatically. But then, the unthinkable happened. The penicillin ran out. The bacteria, which had been beaten back, returned with a vengeance. The infection surged, and Albert Alexander relapsed and died. It was a tragic but vital lesson. Their miracle drug worked. Now, they just needed to make enough of it. With Britain under siege, large-scale production was impossible. So in the summer of 1941, Florey traveled to the United States. The American government and pharmaceutical companies saw the potential. They poured immense resources into the project. They found a new, more potent strain of the mold on a cantaloupe in a market in Peoria, Illinois. They developed new fermentation techniques. By D-Day in 1944, there was enough penicillin to treat every single wounded Allied soldier. The death rate from bacterial pneumonia in the Army plummeted from 18% down to less than 1%. It was, without a doubt, one of the most important factors in the Allied victory. The delayed miracle had finally arrived, just in time. In 1945, Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Chain were jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Fleming, with his characteristic humility, always stressed that nature made penicillin. He had only discovered it by accident. But it was his prepared mind, Florey's determination, and Chain's chemical genius that together turned a chance observation on a moldy plate into a revolution that saved, and continues to save, hundreds of millions of lives.